How's it going, guys? My name's John. I'm with Zebulon Pottery. In today's video, we're talking about how to make your own pottery glazes. Stick around. Talking about the tools you're going to need. They're pretty simple to come by. I will have a link in the description for pretty much everything in this video and timestamps, so you're more than welcome to skip around. Tools, you're going to want a couple of 5-gallon buckets. Depending on how much glaze you mix, you might want some smaller buckets. I have a 2-gallon bucket here for the batch I'm going to be making. You'll find different conversions, and some of this is personal preference. I tend to mix 1,000 grams of material per gallon of whatever size bucket I'm using for the max. So for this batch, I'm going to do 1,000 grams of material for this 2-gallon bucket. And the reason you don't want to go above that is because if you plan on dipping or doing anything like that, you don't want the bucket to overflow when you put the pottery piece inside it. So tools that you're going to need, you're going to want a couple of mesh screens. A 60 or an 80 mesh screen will do you. I prefer having both. The 80 mesh screen makes your job a little bit easier, but the 60 mesh screen is going to homogenize things a little bit better. To work with those screens, you're going to want some kind of brush tool. This hooks onto those screens and you spin it and it helps push everything down. You can do that with any kind of brush. This just makes the job easier. And then you're going to need your raw materials. You're going to want a scale with some kind of container to put everything in. I prefer glass or metal. Talking about scales, you're going to want something that measures in grams. If you're using a digital scale, something that reads to the tenths or the hundredths place is preferred. So first or second digit after the decimal. And yes, a metal scoop, also important. Plastic tends to get abrasions on it, and then material tends to grab hold of it, so getting things like glass and metal will last you longer. So before you start mixing up your glazes, there are a few things you want to consider when it comes to safety. Wearing a mask and wearing gloves is important. Some of these materials, and I will have a list of those materials that are dangerous. Also, your skin is an organ and it does absorb some of these materials, and you want to limit that as much as you possibly can. An interesting fact would be, for generations, potters have lived on average about 10 years less than the average individual, and that's because of the way potters have dealt with these chemicals. So it's, I don't say it lightly, you should really consider wearing the proper safety equipment. We're making a purple glaze today. We use nepheline sienite, silica, whitening ball clay, frit. We're going to be using tin oxide, chrome oxide, cobalt oxide, and red iron oxide and bentonite. Two things to note that are toxic in this glaze is the chrome oxide and the cobalt carbonate. So you do want to be cautious when you're using certain things like this. They are hazardous. Now when we start talking about how much material we need to put in, every glaze recipe you use is going to be broken down into percentages. And the way I do my glaze recipe is I write it out on a separate sheet of paper in the order that I'm going to put them in, and I have the percentage on one side and the actual gram on the other. For example, silica in this glaze is 30%. If I'm doing 1,000 grams, I'm going to multiply 1,000 by 0.30, and that is the simplest way, in my opinion, to get your total measurement in grams. And once again, knowing how many grams you want to put into a bucket really depends on the size of the bucket, and I usually stick to 1,000 grams per gallon. Once I've determined how many grams I need, I make sure that I have a pencil or a pen, and you cut your scale on, you tear it out or you zero it out so that it does not account for the weight of the glass. I know that I need 180 grams of this nepheline. I use my metal scoop and I dump this in. So I got 173 grams on that first scoop. I try to get as close as I can. So 183.5. Now I'm gonna start pulling some out until I'm spot on. So this is 180 grams. I take that 180 grams, I drop it into my 5-gallon bucket. One of the things I do to help with safety is I put about 1 inch of water in the bottom of this 5-gallon bucket, and that helps keep the dust down. So wearing a mask and doing things like this that help limit how much dust is in the air. We're outside, so it's a little bit safer, but these are things to consider. Anything you can do to make it safer for you is something you should do. So now that I put that 180 grams in, I come in on my piece of paper and I mark it through, and that way I know where I am in my glaze. I don't care how good your memory is. Doing these steps like this, it might seem remedial, it might seem like a step you can skip, but you will mess glazes up and waste materials if you don't do, this is the system I was taught on, and it's tried and true. So make sure, however you're mixing your glazes, that you know exactly how much you're putting into your glaze. And now we have 300 grams of silica in this glass container. I'm going to take and drop this in my bucket of water. And once I've dropped it in, I go ahead and mark it out. So now we've gotten through the base recipe. So I think it's important to talk about the additives on a glaze recipe. Your base glaze recipe adds up to 100%. Your additives are added on top of that base. And I will explain that a little bit more in the math. But if it looks funny, that's just because it is, you know. Happens. Alrighty guys, so recording this the next day. We just ran out of time yesterday. But one of the things you're going to want to do is you're going to want to mix this up. Try to do this without using your hand, or if you're going to use your hand, wear a glove, find a stirring stick, something to mix your bucket up with. What you're going to do is try to pre-mix it, homogenize it the best you can. I like using a paintbrush just because the bristles can kind of get in the edges a little bit better than a stick, but anything will work. You can see like the bigger chunks like right here. I just take and wiggle them against the side and try to crush them down the best I can. Alrighty, so we got two different meshes. We got an 80 and a 60 mesh screen. Use the 80 mesh first because it's got the larger holes in it. I set my brush up on the bucket like this. I lock that in place and I try to pour it so that I don't get too much on this metal part because that's just wasted material. And then I'm going to just pour this right in. And then once this is all mixed up with water, it's a little bit safer because you're not going to have any dust flying around. But it's still not good for it to get on your skin and things like that, depending on what's in the glaze formula. And then once we've done this, all I have to do is spin this. And I will change the shot so you can see everything kind of pouring down. But it grinds everything up into that 80 mesh sleeve and slowly trickles down into the new bucket. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do this anywhere from 3 to 6, maybe 8 times, depending on how homogenized it is and how it looks and feels. And some of that is just experience, but if you've ever painted with a glaze before, you kind of know what you're looking for with the consistency. What you're going to notice is we got some larger clumps in here. I'm not really sure if you can see that super well on the camera, but what I do is once I get the larger clumps, I just try to break them up with my paintbrush and push that into the screen. Once you've done this the first time, don't really come back unless the glaze sits for a really long time. And even then, most of the time, all you got to do is mix it. What I'm going to do now is I have gone back and forth between this bucket about 3 or 4 times. So what I'm doing now is I'm dropping the 60 mesh screen. I'm doing the exact same thing, except now the screen I'm going to be using is a little bit finer. Now all my clumps are pretty much gone, but the 60 mesh screen is really going to homogenize everything for me. Once things are sieved really well, you can tell because they basically just pour through the screen. I'm just going to pour this from this bucket back into this one. And one of the reasons I like having 5-gallon buckets is because most of these sieves fit on the 5-gallon bucket perfectly. You can use them on the 2-gallon buckets, but you got to keep them balanced. And then I'm going to show you how I test for glaze consistency. Now you can do it with I believe it's called a hydrometer. You put it into your glaze and it floats, and it tells you what the density of the things floating in the water are. I don't have one. They're kind of expensive. Alrighty, so you see my finger where the fingernail is and the knuckle? If I dip it in the glaze and pull it up, and it runs down my finger where I can see the outline of my fingernail, but I can't see anything else, that's about perfect consistency for me. And that's how I was told to check for consistency. I know it's probably not the safest way, just because you have to do it without wearing gloves, and you can get a tool that'll do it, but that tool's a couple $100. So if you're really worried about it, just make sure that the things that are going into your glaze are not dangerous. Knowing what you're putting into your glaze as an artist can be a huge advantage, and there is a little bit of responsibility that goes along with making your own glazes. So if you're selling for food safe consumption and things like that, make sure you're getting your glaze recipes from somebody who had them tested and somebody who is respected. And if you make your own, you can get them tested, but generally what I do is if I make my own and formulate my own glaze, I just consider it non-food safe and sell it on things like vases. So where we're at right now is we are taking the glaze out of the 5-gallon bucket and putting it into the 2-gallon bucket. And I know that this is going to fit perfectly fine because we're within that 1,000 grams per gallon. And then all I typically do is I'll use a brush to help me clean out the last little remaining bits. And then I'm going to show you guys how much is actually in this 2-gallon bucket. Alrighty, so right now you can tell that the glaze comes up to right about there, and that is, to give you an idea what 2,000 grams would look like in this bucket, it would come up to maybe right about here. And that gives you plenty of room for like a cup if you wanted to dip it into this without the glaze rising and running over the edge. So if your glaze is too soupy and you want it to thicken up, all you need to do is wait a day or two, and the materials will sink to the bottom and the water will come to the top, right? All you'll need to do is take a bowl or something like that and pull some of the water out. You'll eventually figure out how much water you went in the bucket. If it's too thick, all you need to do is add more water. Alrighty guys, we got one last thing to do before we're done making our glaze. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you guys to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and I appreciate you watching. So the very last thing we're going to need is a Sharpie, and we're going to label all of our stuff, right? So we know this is cone 6, and the little triangle represents a cone. I put a little 6. It's always nice to put a little line under it, just in case people get it mixed up, but that should be pretty obvious. And then I label it whatever color, and then sometimes I'll put little notes, like I'll draw a line like this, lets me know, okay, and then I'll do notes, like, let's say this purple's really, really dark, or, you know, certain things I don't ever want to use it on. I'll actually just write that on the lid. And it's nice when you're, you know, dipping your stuff or spraying your stuff to kind of have those notes right here and not just in your binder. It is also really important to keep a binder and write down notes in that, but putting your notes on the lid, not a bad idea. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. There are a few other videos on my channel that I'm sure you'll enjoy, and we'll have links, little blocks that you can touch right here or there, something like that. Thanks a lot, guys.